Hello, my name is Stephen Denman. My organisation is Shining Guidance. My website is shiningguidance.com. I'm going to talk to you today about the positives and negatives of using different types of schooling for children who have autism spectrum disorder ASD. Children with autism spectrum disorder ASD are often included in more neurotypical educational settings such as classrooms and lecture theatres, as some of them have not been effectively diagnosed by a general practitioner or GP and therefore appear normal and therefore are then placed into a normalised educational setting with more neurotypical pupils or students. However, those children or adolescents who have autism spectrum disorder ASD do not always thrive in such kinds of educational settings. And as a parent of a child with autism spectrum disorder ASD, they might want to carefully consider looking at a school that exclusively tailors to the needs, the wants, and expectations of children who have autism spectrum disorder ASD. Now, a number of articles have been written by some very credible journals in the media world. And I'd like to discuss a couple of these. And these really are concerned with the advantages and disadvantages of using neurotypical educational settings for children who have autism spectrum disorder ASD conditions and using proactive measures to ensure that individuals in colleges who have autism spectrum disorder ASD are able to excel in their educational journey in a professional, timely and prompt manner and actually have an effective and positive outcome in their educational journey. So on the 13th of June 2020, an article was published in the online magazine called Health Central that was created by Remedy Health Media. The article was called Pros and Cons of Mainstream Classrooms for Kids with Autism. This article gives very detailed and completely valid lists of the advantages and disadvantages of using neurotypical classrooms for children with autism spectrum disorder ASD. On the 7th of October 2022, the Child Mind Institute published an article called Going to College with Autism, which showed how adolescent individuals with autism spectrum disorder ASD can actually, in an effective and proactive way, find solutions to have a successful education-based experience in colleges. So we know that it's a real challenge for many individuals out there who are in educational settings who have autism spectrum disorder ASD conditions to really get themselves across in the right way so they can actually fully benefit from studying different academic subject matter in either one of these types of educational settings. I want to specifically look at the advantages and disadvantages now of using autism spectrum disorder or ASD only educational settings for children and adolescents. So settings that were specifically designed and constructed for those individuals with autism spectrum disorder or ASD can become tremendously beneficial environments for those children or adolescents, particularly for those of more severe aspects of the psychological condition. And here are some of the advantages. With appropriate adaptations being put into place, those children and adolescents with autism spectrum disorder ASD can focus more on learning and less on trying to approximate the social behaviours of neurotypical peers around them. Whenever there are not any sensory distractions, children with autism spectrum disorder ASD can let go of some of their anxieties and truly relax in the environment around them. And settings that are autism spectrum disorder ASD only are able to spend their annual budgets on the needs, wants and expectations of those pupils or students with autism spectrum disorder ASD, which means better technologies and more appropriate types of autism spectrum disorder ASD condition type furnishings and health and safety practices can be put into place in a timely and prompt manner. In those schools and colleges which are only for autism spectrum disorder ASD individuals, they are able to focus on the activities in a more timely and kept manner, and because everything is focused in on that specific type of individual. For example, they can participate in independent sports rather than team sports if the latter causes them emotional and psychological distress. Whilst children and adolescents with autism spectrum disorder don't always connect with one another on a more so personalised and social based level, being at an autism spectrum disorder ASD only school or college can allow them to find others to share common interests with, and they'll feel needed, wanted and included and not feel isolated and rejected and abandoned. And they may feel better understood by their more neurotypical peers around them, and instead of feeling like outsiders, they may no longer feel estranged or alienated. They actually feel for the first time in their lives that they are fully understood. There's a higher level of discernment about their own psychological condition. Now, for parents, knowing that their child is in an autism spectrum disorder ASD setting can relieve huge amounts of anxiety and stress that they have been feeling previous to that actual event taking place, because there's a huge bond of trust that develops with the facilitators of such educational settings, because obviously they're fully trained, qualified, certificated and accredited to deal with such individual children with autism spectrum disorder or ASD conditions. Now I'm going to look at the disadvantage of using autism spectrum disorder ASD only educational settings. Now, in a neurotypical educational setting, children can learn skills that they'll need for later in life, preparing them for the adult world, so to speak, which in a more specialised autism spectrum disorder or ASD setting may not be the case with problem solving skills or advocate based solving skills, which are essential really for them for later life at adulthood. Even the use of neurotypical based school assemblies and team sports can actually help with developing these more long term life skills that they need. Within a neurotypical school setting, children with autism spectrum disorder ASD have wider opportunities to explore new ideas, concepts, and topics, and to develop their own unique cognitive and intellectual skills. In a school that is autism spectrum disorder ASD only, there are fewer opportunities, and the existing ones are obviously specifically designed around the anticipated interests and needs of any pupil or student who has autism spectrum disorder ASD. So you can see very clear and stark contrast there. And throughout the wider community, individuals with autism spectrum disorder ASD can take place alongside those pupils and actually assist them in extracurricular based activities alongside neurotypical pupils in developing self-confidence, and studying subjects like music and team sports outside the immediate neurotypical school setting, but which have been facilitated and organised by teachers within that setting. And that may also include things like studying scientific endeavours and preparing those pupils to understand more about the workplace and vocational skills training, for example. Now, in an autism spectrum disorder ASD only setting, everything is artificially set up for assessed optimum outcomes, of course, and so this leads to an avoidance of actually allowing those individuals with autism spectrum disorder ASD conditions to actually face challenging sensory situations, such to do with bright lights and noisy rooms, as just one example. And of course, involvement in community experiences can allow those individuals with autism spectrum disorder ASD to challenge themselves and exceed their own expectations. And for those parents of any child who has autism spectrum disorder ASD, having them placed in a neurotypical setting means that other parents and members of the community can get to know and understand and appreciate their child's psychological condition, because they're no longer isolated, if they were, say, in an autism spectrum disorder ASD only educational setting. So I hope you've enjoyed watching this video as much as I've enjoyed presenting the information to you. And I think it's something that you need to reflect on. It's very important for people out there to understand there is a choice that can be made between using either type of setting, whether it is an autism spectrum disorder or ASD only educational setting or a neurotypical educational setting for a child, whether they be very young or they've become an adolescent. And really, it's down to those parents liaising with, shall we say, the headmaster of that specific type of autism spectrum disorder ASD only school or neurotypical educational setting to really make a decision on what they want to do. There are obviously very stark and clear contrasts in the advantages and disadvantages of using either educational setting. And in many ways, individuals who have autism spectrum disorder ASD do need to kind of challenge their own limitations emotionally and psychologically, because later in life, as they enter adulthood, and they go out in real time into the 3D holographic reality of this material dimension, into the workplace, being amongst more neurotypical individuals, they're going to need to really be as self-aware of their own psychological condition as possible. And so being in a more neurotypical educational setting would be very beneficial for that. But again, you've got to weigh up the pros and cons, the advantages and disadvantages of both types of educational settings. Anyway, on that note, thank you very much for watching what I've presented here. It's been very enjoyable for me to present this information to you, and there'll be many more videos to come in the near future. And on that note, I'd like to say take care, everybody, and I will speak to you very soon.